When the police first entered the farmhouse, they didn't expect to find two teenage girls, both 16, both pregnant, both naming the same man as the father. He wasn't a stranger, he wasn't a drifter, he was their uncle, the patriarch of the family, the man everyone in town called Pa. It should have been the end of the story. Two victims, one monster. But what they found inside that house didn't fit any script of small-town tragedy. It was something far older, darker, and deliberate. The walls were lined with photographs of the same faces repeating through generations, the same pale eyes, the same crooked jawline. Every child looked like a reflection of the one before it, as if time had stopped reproducing new people and started recycling the same ones. The locals didn't want to talk about it. When reporters came, they said the family kept to themselves, that they didn't bother nobody. But in a place that quiet, silence wasn't innocence. It was participation. The patriarch's land stretched across miles of forgotten woodland, fenced off with rusted barbed wire and signs that read "Private Bloodline, Keep Out." Years later, when the house was finally searched again, investigators found something beneath the floorboards of the back room, a stack of burned notebooks, some pages still legible. One read, "He says it keeps the blood strong. He says outsiders make us weak." Another page described nights when the family gathered in the barn, whispering prayers not from any church but from a language no one recognized. No one ever found the two girls again. Their names vanished from school records, their graves unmarked. All that remained was a single family portrait, 6 figures staring into the camera, their expressions empty, their resemblance uncanny. The man in the center, the patriarch, had one hand resting on each of the girls' shoulders. His smile was calm, proud, like he believed he was preserving something sacred. And maybe he was. Because when investigators finally ran DNA tests decades later, they realized the truth wasn't just a story of abuse. It was the story of a family that had stopped evolving and started folding inward, creating something no longer entirely human. The story began on a cold morning in late autumn, the kind that carries a strange stillness across the hills of Appalachia. The sheriff's office had received an anonymous call, no name, no details, just a trembling voice saying, "You need to check the Miller place. The girls, they're not right." It was the kind of tip the deputies were used to ignoring. People around these parts minded their own business. But that morning, something in the caller's tone didn't sound like gossip. It sounded like fear. When the two deputies arrived, the farmhouse was quiet, its windows boarded from the inside, the yard littered with broken toys and rusted farm tools. The air smelled of wood smoke and decay, and there was a faint trail of footprints in the frost, small ones leading toward the barn. Inside the house, they found the two girls sitting at the kitchen table. Both were 16, both dressed in nightgowns that looked handmade, and both stared at the officers without saying a word. The silence was thick, like a weight pressing down on the room. One of the girls had bruises on her wrists, faint but visible. The other kept clutching her stomach. When asked if anyone else was home, neither answered. The deputies exchanged a glance, their instincts prickling. They started searching the rest of the house, moving slowly down the hall, lined with family portraits. The same faces repeating again and again, generation after generation. Eyes so similar it was hard to tell one person from another. The patriarch, known to everyone in town as Pa Miller, was found sitting in the living room in his rocking chair. He didn't look surprised to see them. His face was calm, expressionless, as though he'd been expecting this visit. The man was in his late 60s but looked older, his skin gray and papery, his eyes pale blue, sharp as glass. When they told him they'd received a complaint, he smiled and said softly, "Family business, ain't nobody else's concern." The deputies asked about the girls. He said they were his nieces, that he'd been taking care of them since their mother passed away years ago. The younger deputy noticed the way the man's hand trembled slightly when he spoke, the way his eyes darted toward the hallway. Something in that calm voice felt rehearsed. When they asked the girls again if they were okay, one of them finally spoke. Her voice was so quiet it barely rose above the creak of the house. "He says we're chosen," she whispered. The older deputy leaned closer, trying to catch her words, but before she could continue, The man's tone changed. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor, and said, "That's enough now." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried an authority that froze everyone in place. They decided to bring the girls in for questioning anyway. The man didn't resist. He only watched as they were led out, his lips pressed into a thin line. As they walked them to the car, the older girl turned once to look back at the farmhouse. Her expression was unreadable, part fear, part confusion, part something else, something deeper, as though she couldn't decide whether she was being rescued or taken away from the only thing she knew. At the station, the interviews began separately. The first girl barely spoke. She kept her eyes fixed on the table, her hands trembling. It was the younger one who broke first. She said things that didn't make sense at first, about keeping the blood pure, about the family's promise, about how Pa said their ancestors had been chosen by God to protect something in their bloodline. When the deputies asked her who the father of her unborn child was, she hesitated, looked toward the mirror on the wall as if expecting someone to be behind it, and then said, "It's him." They asked her to clarify. "Pa," she whispered. "He says it has to be him. He says outsiders ruin us." The room went silent. One of the officers stepped outside to call the sheriff. When they returned, the girl was crying softly, rocking back and forth, repeating the same words over and over. "We have to keep it in the blood. He says that's how God stays with us." The sheriff, a man who'd lived his whole life in those hills, stared at her like he didn't quite believe what he was hearing. He told one of his men to drive back to the farmhouse and bring the old man in for questioning. When they arrived, the house was empty. The front door hung open, the rocking chair still swaying slightly, as if someone had just stood up. The only sound was the wind pushing through the cracks in the walls. They searched every room, every shed, every corner of the property, but there was no trace of him. What they did find was worse. In the cellar, behind a curtain of hanging tools, they found a locked trunk. Inside were old family Bibles, each one with the same last name written in careful cursive, dating back over a century. But the pages weren't filled with scripture. They were filled with lists, names, birth dates, and notations like blood confirmed and purity maintained. The deeper they looked, the more the records blurred together. Cousins married cousins. Nieces became wives. Children born of siblings were listed as new line. The pattern was undeniable, stretching back 5 generations. In the margins of one book, someone had written, "The Lord made us separate, and separate we must remain." By the time investigators returned to the station, the girls were gone. No one saw them leave, no one saw a car, no one reported anything unusual. Their empty chairs were still warm, the half-finished cups of water still on the table. The sheriff called for roadblocks, but nothing turned up. It was as if they had simply vanished. The story spread quietly through the town, but no one said much. A few people claimed they'd always known something was strange about that family, that their children never went to school, that they never showed up at church, that you could hear singing from the woods on certain nights. But when reporters came, the locals clammed up. "Family business," they said, "best left alone." And so it was left alone. The farmhouse was eventually abandoned, the windows sealed again, the land overgrown. But the files, the Bibles, the lists, they told a story the town refused to face. 2 16-year-old girls, carrying their uncle's children, weren't the start of the horror. They were the end of a long, hidden tradition, one born out of delusion, fear, and the belief that blood was more sacred than morality. What those deputies uncovered that morning wasn't a crime of passion or madness. It was the final chapter of a family that had spent generations folding inward, convinced they were preserving something holy, while in truth they were erasing their own humanity piece by piece. The town was small enough that everyone knew everyone, yet somehow no one seemed to know anything. After the farmhouse incident, the sheriff expected people to start talking, to come forward with rumors or confessions whispered behind closed doors. But instead, the silence thickened. Questions were met with shrugs, and eyes that once met his began to look away. The old women who sat on porches every afternoon suddenly stopped gathering there. Men who had always been friendly stopped tipping their hats. The town became quieter, not out of ignorance, but out of agreement, a silent pact to forget what had been uncovered. When reporters from the nearest city arrived, hoping to turn the scandal into headlines, they found doors closing before they could even knock. Every question was met with the same phrase: "That's family business." It was the town's way of burying what it didn't want to face. People spoke about the Millers only in past tense, as if pretending the family had already been erased from their history. They said the land was cursed, that it had been that way long before Pa was born. Some claimed that anyone who tried to meddle with that bloodline always ended up ruined. Whether it was fear or superstition, no one dared to challenge the silence that hung over those hills. The journalist, who had arrived weeks after the story broke, found the tension suffocating. In the diner, conversations would stop when he entered. When he asked about the nieces, the waitress simply said, "You're not from here, are you?" and walked away. At the hardware store, the owner refused to sell him batteries once he realized who he was. The sense of hostility wasn't loud. It was quiet, careful, and united. It was the kind of silence that comes not from confusion, but from collective guilt. The people of that town hadn't just ignored the family's darkness, they had protected it. One night, an older man who worked as a janitor at the courthouse stopped the journalist outside the diner. He said he remembered the Patriarch from years back, how he'd show up at town meetings and preach about preserving the line. The man lowered his voice, eyes darting around the empty street. "We all knew," he whispered. "But what were we supposed to do? Folks around here don't bring the law into family matters. You start doing that, next thing you know, you got no neighbors left." Then he walked away before another question could be asked. In the courthouse archives, the journalist discovered a strange pattern. Every document connected to the Miller family had either been misplaced or refiled under incorrect years. Birth certificates missing, property deeds unsigned, death records marked as confidential. When he asked the clerk about it, she gave a tired sigh and said there had been a fire decades ago that destroyed most of the records. But there was no mention of any such fire in the local newspaper archives. Later, he learned that the clerk was the daughter of the Patriarch's cousin. Even the church stayed silent. The pastor, when approached, refused to comment, claiming he didn't get involved in old sins. But a few nights later, someone slipped a note under the journalist's motel door. It was written in shaky handwriting. "He made us promise not to tell. He said it would bring the sickness back." There was no signature, no address, just that single line. The implication was clear. The family's power didn't end with the farmhouse. It ran through the entire town like a root system, invisible but alive. The more the journalist dug, the more he realized that the silence wasn't just fear of the man, but fear of what he represented. The family's story wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a reflection of something the whole town shared. A tradition of secrecy, a loyalty to blood that ran deeper than morality. Outsiders saw it as complicity, but to them, it was survival. The Patriarch wasn't just one man, he was the embodiment of their past, a reminder of what they were willing to ignore to keep peace among their own. In the end, the town didn't deny the horrors outright. They simply erased them from conversation. They boarded up the farmhouse, bulldozed the barn, and let the land rot in silence. When the journalist asked one final question before leaving, "Do you think anyone still lives out there?" the sheriff paused for a long moment before answering. "No," he said quietly. "But some nights, when the wind's right, you can still hear singing coming from those woods. Best not to listen too close." Then he turned and walked away, leaving the air heavy with the weight of unspoken truth. The discovery of the family photographs was what changed everything. Until that moment, most of what people knew about the inbred family was rumor, stories told by locals who claimed to have heard strange noises in the woods or seen figures moving near the abandoned farmhouse. But when a box of old photographs surfaced, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in one of the rooms, the truth began to take on a face, or rather, several faces, each more unsettling than the last. The images were grainy, taken on cheap film, their edges curled and yellowed by time. Yet despite the decay, what they revealed could not be dismissed. In one photograph, a group of children stood in a line outside the farmhouse. At first glance, they looked like any other rural family from the early 1900s, barefoot, thin, dressed in patched clothing. But the longer one stared, the more the irregularities emerged. Some of the children had eyes that didn't align properly. Others had expressions frozen somewhere between confusion and pain. Their limbs were twisted, their features mismatched in a way that defied normal human variation. The photographer had clearly tried to pose them neatly, but the attempt at order only made the chaos more visible. One of the boys was staring directly into the camera with an intensity that felt almost accusatory, as if he knew the photograph would one day expose what the town had tried to bury. Other photos showed family gatherings inside the farmhouse, dimly lit rooms with cracked wallpaper, rotting furniture, and a single oil lamp casting long, trembling shadows. There were wedding photos, too, though it was difficult to tell who was marrying whom. The faces looked too similar. Siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles all blending into one another. Generations of the same blood trapped in an endless loop. Some of the photos had names scribbled on the back in faded ink, but many were simply marked with numbers, as if even the photographer couldn't keep track of who was who. Experts who later analyzed the photos confirmed that the deformities were consistent with extreme genetic isolation. Years of reproduction within the same lineage had led to visible mutations: cleft lips, misaligned jaws, abnormal skull structures, and signs of mental impairment. But beyond the biological evidence, there was something else the photos conveyed: an atmosphere of despair, a haunting stillness that no science could explain. Each image seemed to whisper that the people in them were both victims and prisoners, bound to a fate written in their own blood. The most disturbing photograph of all was one that seemed almost accidental. It showed a woman standing by a window, half her face obscured by light. In her arms was a baby whose features were barely human: swollen eyes, mouth open as if mid-cry, limbs too small for its body. The woman's expression was unreadable, not sadness, not anger, but resignation, like someone who had long stopped expecting mercy. That single photo circulated quietly among researchers and journalists, often blurred or cropped to hide the infant's face, but it became a symbol of the entire tragedy. A moment frozen in time that captured the price of isolation and silence. The photographs didn't just document a family. They revealed an entire system that had allowed such a thing to exist unchecked. They exposed how the town's secrecy had created a kind of moral blindness, where horror became routine. The townspeople had known, they had to have known, yet they chose to look away. These images forced them to confront what their silence had protected. Some tried to claim the photos were fake, that outsiders had manipulated them for profit. But deep down, everyone who had lived near those hills knew they were real. The photos were too intimate, too personal to have been fabricated. They carried the kind of authenticity that only comes from pain. Even years later, when the farmhouse was demolished and the family's descendants disappeared into anonymity, the photographs remained as the only proof of what had once existed there. They were displayed in museums, published in dark history books, and analyzed in documentaries, each time reopening wounds that the town desperately wanted to forget. Yet no matter how much time passed, the same uneasy feeling lingered, that there were more photos out there, still hidden, waiting to be found. And perhaps somewhere in those unseen pictures lay the final truth, not just of the family's deformities, but of the society that let them happen, one silent generation at a time. When the investigative team arrived at the family's burial grounds, it was supposed to be a brief visit, just a few photographs, a few notes for the record. But what they found beneath the overgrown weeds and broken fence posts turned into the darkest revelation yet. The graves weren't arranged in any recognizable pattern. They were scattered, uneven, as though each burial had been done in secret. Most of the markers were made from rough stones with no names carved into them, only faint scratches or crude initials. Some of the mounds were small, far too small to belong to adults. The air smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves, but there was something else underneath, a faint metallic scent that lingered unnaturally, as if the ground itself was trying to hide a memory. The local records claimed that only 9 people were buried there, but when ground-penetrating scans were done, the number of bodies was closer to 30. The shocking part wasn't just how many there were, it was how close they'd been buried together. Whole generations layered in shallow soil, as if the family had been quietly stacking their dead, erasing them as they went. Some of the remains showed clear signs of malformation, elongated skulls, fused joints, spinal distortions. But among the remains were also bones that didn't match the genetic markers of the family line, suggesting that outsiders, perhaps workers, travelers, or even distant relatives, had been brought there and never left. One particular grave caught everyone's attention. It was deeper than the rest, the dirt darker and compacted, and when unearthed, it revealed the skeleton of a grown man clutching something small in his hand. It turned out to be a rusted silver locket containing 2 miniature portraits of young girls. The portraits matched the likeness of the teenage nieces from the early family photos, the same 2 who, according to town gossip, had disappeared without explanation after giving birth. The discovery confirmed what had long been whispered, that the Patriarch had not only fathered children through his nieces, but had also buried the evidence when things went wrong. Even stranger was what the soil revealed beneath that grave. Fragments of cloth and splintered wood that had once been part of a cradle. Someone had buried it deliberately, as if trying to lay a newborn to rest along with the man who created it. The investigators realized this wasn't just a burial site, it was a family's entire history of guilt and shame pressed into the ground. Every grave told a story of silence, and every unmarked stone was a reminder that in this place, even the dead had been hidden to protect the living. When the journals were finally uncovered, they filled in the silence the photographs could not. Hidden inside a locked trunk beneath the floorboards of the farmhouse's second bedroom, the pages were brittle, ink faded, and many words almost erased by time. The handwriting was uneven, written in moments of shaking hands and sleepless nights. They belonged to the Patriarch himself, a man whose name had long been erased from official records, leaving only his voice behind. The early entries read like those of any farmer, describing weather, harvests, and the daily struggle of rural life. But as the years went on, the tone began to shift. His words became more erratic, the sentences darker, filled with obsession over keeping the blood pure and maintaining the family's strength. It became clear that what had started as isolation had evolved into madness disguised as tradition. He wrote about how outsiders could not be trusted, how the family had to stay untouched by foreign sickness. He spoke of divine signs, dreams that told him to preserve the line, and warnings that those who mix the blood will bring ruin. Slowly the journals began to document not life but breeding, records of marriages between cousins, births, deaths, deformities. Some pages were dedicated to the 2 teenage nieces, whom he described not as relatives but as chosen vessels. His words were void of remorse, framed by a twisted sense of destiny. What made it worse was how methodical he was. He treated the family like an experiment, recording features, behaviors, and illnesses as if he were documenting livestock rather than people. In one particularly chilling entry, he mentioned a child born without breath whose eyes would not close. He described burying it himself before the sun rose to keep the curse contained. Other entries suggested that he believed the deformities were punishments from God, yet instead of stopping, he doubled down, insisting that purity must be restored by continuing the same acts that had caused the suffering. The journals revealed not just insanity but a kind of self-righteous control, a belief that his cruelty was sacred duty. When historians later analyzed the writing, they noticed clear signs of delusion and possible genetic degeneration in the Patriarch himself, his language breaking down, his reasoning slipping into paranoia. The final pages were almost illegible, written in frantic scrawl, repeating a single phrase over and over again: "The blood must stay within." By the time the last entry ended, he was no longer a man recording his life, but the echo of a mind devoured by its own creation, convinced that what he was doing was not evil, but holy. When word of the discovery spread beyond the small town, journalists, historians, and documentary crews descended on the area, each hoping to capture a glimpse of the place that had become synonymous with horror. The farmhouse, once hidden by trees and silence, became a site of grim fascination. Locals who had spent their lives avoiding it suddenly found themselves surrounded by strangers with cameras and microphones, asking questions they had spent decades trying to forget. Some residents refused to speak, locking their doors and drawing their curtains tight. Others told half-truths, mixing rumor with fact, as if afraid that saying too much might awaken something best left buried. Government officials attempted to contain the chaos, marking off the land and declaring it unsafe, but that only fueled curiosity. Researchers wanted to study the genetic remains, journalists wanted the human tragedy, and tourists wanted the thrill of standing where it all happened. The town's identity, once ordinary and quiet, became consumed by the story of one family's decay. Businesses tried to distance themselves from the scandal, but the name stuck. It was no longer just a forgotten rural town. It was the place where it happened. Amid the growing frenzy, rumors began to spread of missing artifacts, pages torn from the journals, photographs that had vanished from evidence, and even bones that couldn't be accounted for. Some believed locals had taken them as grim souvenirs. Others whispered that certain things were deliberately kept hidden because they contained truths darker than the public could handle. By the time the media moved on to the next story, the town was left hollow, its people haunted not just by what had been found, but by what had escaped being found, as if the family's legacy still lingered quietly in the soil beneath their feet. Years after the investigation ended, people who ventured near the old property began reporting strange occurrences. Locals claimed to hear children's laughter echoing from the woods at night, even though the area had been abandoned for decades. Some said they saw figures moving in the fields, small, hunched silhouettes that disappeared when approached. Others described hearing rhythmic tapping beneath the ground, as if something buried deep was trying to claw its way out. A few paranormal investigators who entered the ruins reported an overwhelming sense of pressure in their chests, like the air itself was rejecting them. One traveler who camped near the site awoke to find tiny handprints pressed into the outside of his tent, though no one else had been around for miles. Another swore she saw a light flickering from inside the demolished farmhouse, just one steady glow, as if someone was still there, keeping watch. Over time, the stories became so persistent that even skeptics avoided the area after dark. The place that had once been a symbol of human corruption became something else entirely, a silent warning of what happens when nature, morality, and bloodline all rot together and leave behind something that refuses to die. Years later, when the property was finally purchased by a private developer, the new owners began digging to clear the land for construction. Within days, the workers unearthed a cluster of objects that halted the project instantly. Child-sized shoes, a rusted crib frame, and shards of glass from what appeared to be old photographic negatives. A faint imprint of a face was still visible on one of the fragments, frozen in a distorted expression that made even the foreman step back in silence. Authorities were called, and though they sealed the site once more, the discovery reignited everything. News outlets returned, historians demanded re-examination, and suddenly, the curse of the bloodline was alive again. The developers abandoned the land, leaving it fenced off and untouched, swallowed once more by weeds and silence. Even now, locals say the earth there feels wrong, cold even in summer, still even when the wind blows. Some claim to hear whispers when they pass, faint and pleading, as if the ground itself remembers what was buried in it. And while the official record insists the family's story has ended, those who live nearby know better. Because every time the soil shifts after rain, it seems to breathe. And maybe it's trying to speak again. If you think you've heard everything about America's forgotten families, think again. The truth still sleeps beneath the dirt, waiting to be unearthed.